Author versus the Werewolf. A Mutant Ideas production by Bill Couture and Chris Marti. Original music by Cosmic Monster.
The author. I woke up with one beast of a hangover and flung my phone in disgust. Hours, days, months had gone by. The constant screaming distraction of 1,000 vibrations, derailing my thoughts car by car. A newsworthy international disaster of a packed train of thought. Corpses of aborted stories piled up in the burning debris of distraction. It was a cemetery of good ideas, screaming in undead abject terror, not unlike my pounding head. I wiped the accumulated drool from the week's worth of stubble and what little had pooled on the trackpad of my laptop. This wasn't the first time I passed out at the office. I groaned as I began to stand, pressing my hands into the armrests of the chair. Ugh, that's it. I was halfway up when I lost my balance, catching a glimpse of the mostly empty bottle of mezcal on the way down to crash with me on the living room floor. Time stretched as I pondered my predicament in that split second before colliding with the hardwood. For months I'd been banging away at the next great horror novel of the 21st century, with nothing to show for it but self-imposed bumps and bruises to my ego. Actually, that last part isn't true. This morning's tangle with gravity wasn't the first. The actual bumps and bruises weren't my only badges of honor. I also slid into the occasional bender, and that is an accomplishment in and of itself. Unsurprisingly, that also concerned me. Drinking too much because of writer's block, or lack of talent? Lack of new ideas? Lack of confidence? It's a tale as old as time. The real horror, an ice-cold hand grabbing me by the spine and yanking me back into an infantile state of panic, was absent from every feeble word crawling across the digital pages of 1,000 documents. The plastic bottle bounced several times uneventfully and came to a rest with its neck outstretched, pointing towards my cell phone lying face down in the corner of the room. Then there was the phone, that constant scream pulling me towards anything else other than my work. I was born before the time of the pocket-sized cellular telephone, and had somewhat gotten used to the idea of life without it by the time the damned thing turned into a parasite sucking on the human brain and livelihood. Parasite? Symbiote. I reached out and picked up the battered device, leaning on the wall for balance as I got to my feet. Closing the laptop, I looked past it towards the typewriter case and duffel bag in the hallway closet. Symbiote? Parasite. I thumbed through the 7 missed texts and emails from my agent. Some updates about a project that was loosely sort of adapted from a short story I wrote 10 years ago. It was catching on in the international market, most of which didn't have access to translations of my work. I became a stranger in my own creation, a ghost cog inside of the machinery that bore my name. Frankenstein, the doctor and the monster. Was this the true horror that could capture the zeitgeist and shake readers to the core? This lack of meaning and nihilistic understanding that no matter how hard I worked, it's the perception of the world that would haphazardly choose the words to carve into my tombstone? I sure as hell didn't know, but I was determined to find that horror myself. Later that day, I raced the sun, pressing my foot to the gas. Hour after hour burnt away as I made my way across the miles of winding mountain roads and into the dense forest that held this tiny cabin hostage. No interruptions, no working internet. This isn't just what I need as far as I was concerned. It was my only option whether I liked it or not. I passed scattered convenience stores in various stages of decay and picked up enough to keep myself fed, hydrated, and reasonably hygienic over the course of my stay. It could be weeks before weather would permit the drive back to civilization. It had been a busy season for hurricanes, and the weather report for the next week made the projections for the remainder of the month sound almost comforting. The frequency and damage was already the second highest in the century for this county. Past that, no one bothered to keep accurate records. You assumed death and destruction were an everyday part of life if you were stupid enough to make your home in nature's bullseye. I suppose the biggest difference is now we've given nature a reason to want to fire back at human beings specifically. I didn't pack much. A dried-out duffel bag with more or less a week's worth of clothes, a travel case of toiletries, plus a stack of paper heavy enough to suffocate myself with if necessary. Then there was that ridiculous Italian typewriter with the polished keys. It was gifted to me at the premiere of some movie I didn't really care for, but was involved with to an excruciating degree. Hell, I don't even remember the name of the film. Whatever it was, I was paid just enough for my disappointment. The typewriter sitting in my passenger seat didn't seem to care that it was no longer hunched in the corner of my spare closet collecting dust. If it didn't work, I could always scribble whatever fell out of my head longhand. Someone would be paid to translate the scrawlings, assuming enough reasonably useful words clawed their way out from my mind into my pen and across the paper in the vague, nightmarish silhouette of a story. My concerns about my work fully eclipsed any hesitations from the potential hazards of this isolated stay. The cabin had suited me just fine in the past. Sure, it had been some time since my last visit, but if there was anything I could count on, it's that there wouldn't be a soul for miles to interrupt my work. At the time, I didn't know just how right I was. There was something in the woods, but the thought of that damned thing having a soul of its own was questionable at best. It was a very long and lonely drive to the cabin. One by one, the cars around me fell away. The road twisted and stretched, winding through the dense and looming trees. I knew that I was in the last leg of my journey now by how narrow and worn down the road was quickly becoming. From above, it was like a thin ribbon unspooled across a vast arboreal shag rug. The last sign of life passed miles ago. It was the 6th of 7 convenience stores that marked the transition from civilization to wilderness. Each was spaced further apart than the last. This stretch would be some 13 miles before the final squirt of human life. After the 7th store, it would be miles and miles until I crossed the bridge. A sun-bleached sign peeked out from the side of the road ahead. The last convenience store, 1 mile. 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365. Gas, food. I read the rest aloud to myself. Toilets and glue. The last part a slight embellishment from road delirium, although I did in fact need glue to repair my cracked phone case. The gravel cracked under the weight of my car as I pulled into the parking lot of the convenience store and up to the gas pump. A soggy cardboard sign was haphazardly taped over the control panel of the pump. Cash only, pay inside. I cursed under my breath and made my way toward the front door, digging the remaining cash from my wallet when a rusty bicycle chained to one of the awning support beams caught my attention. That's unusual, I mumbled to myself, still on edge. The image of the abandoned bike was lodged in my brain. It wasn't just a little rusty. Clearly it was there for months. Why didn't management get rid of the thing? It's clearly an eyesore. Well, the place is rustic. That was the kindest way I could describe the near prehistoric establishment. I paid for my food, fuel, and supplies, including the pleasant surprise of fresh limes, and the jangling bell above notified the clerk of my exit as the door slammed shut. I paused and turned to look at the bicycle again, but there was something above the rusted derelict that caught my eye. How I missed it on my way in, I didn't know. Missing child. Then a small photograph. Description, name, last known whereabouts, who to contact and how. Everything a well-intentioned citizen would need. I started the gas pump, the bell clang of the old machinery reminding me it was doing what it's supposed to do. Is that the kid's bike chained up there? That's morbid. The strangeness was mentally noted, and I absent-mindedly shifted my gaze back to the climbing price tag of the trip so far. Moments later, I was back behind the wheel and on my way to cross the threshold to a vast galaxy of trees, the wood and metal bridge constructed somewhere just after World War II. The woods were another planet, another reality, another time. My familiarity started and ended with the cabin. It was my family's vacation home for 3 generations, each utilizing the remote refuge less with each passing generation. The cabin was a wooden nail escape pod, tethered to the planet by that bridge and the long winding road to Mission Control, convenience store number 7. The trees were as dense and deep as space was empty. In the trees, no one can hear you scream. I cracked a smile at the reference, wondering if reading nostalgia worked the same way as seeing it. Amusement melted away from my smile, down my throat and into the pit of my stomach where it cocooned itself into fear. The gravity of my impending isolation drained the warmth from my fingers to join the growing chasm developing in my gut. The gap in the tree line in my rearview mirror slammed shut as my car suddenly dropped a meter into an eroded, muddy divot. The last bar of cell phone service disappeared without a sound. Sunset. The car croaked to a rest in the front yard of the cabin, nestled into the darkness of the forest canopy. Well, this is the place. This is the place. I surveyed the rustic monument to scenic isolation. The key took some finagling before granting me access. I closed the screeching door with my heel and set my things down on the sofa, surveying for any changes since my last visit. My eyes panned across the living room. Fireplace, fire pokers and wrought iron stand, sofa, cassette deck and towering wood-paneled speakers, coffee table, high-backed chair, bookshelf filled to the brim with accompanying books spilling out onto the floor. Same old-ass stuff, same old-ass wear and tear. Onto the kitchen, off-yellow countertop and gasoline stove from the mid-1970s. Knife rack, a little dusty. And a little rusty, like me, I mused. I threw my keys onto the windowsill and paused to appreciate the relief that my surroundings brought me. The sunlight was just starting to soak the still air of the cabin's interior as it prepared to turn in for the night. I tapped my fingers on the glistening keys of the typewriter. The handmade desk next to the window that faced the property line supported the weighty machine just fine. With a yank of the cord, I sent the cracked shades shooting up. The resulting beam of light filled the bedroom for the first time in who knows how long. The setting sun glowed through the cloudy haze of dust particles dancing in slow motion like plankton. Outer space, the ocean floor. I turned and made my way back down the stairs. The devil on my shoulder took that moment to slide into my ear and around my amygdala. I rubbed my clean-shaven chin. I'd made the choice not to bring booze to the creative retreat, but I knew better than to come without a backup plan. Myself. Nothing out in the open. Last time I nearly drank the place dry. But also the lack of note meant the auxiliary "things left here" stash was still strategically placed around the cabin. 3rd time's a charm. My fingers caught the telltale sign that my backup plan was paying off. The dangling and frayed piece of tape in the cabinet under the kitchen sink held a substantial bottle in place at an angle impossible for anyone to see without sticking their hand up into the small and splintery space. Even then, it was not a position anyone would naturally want to put themselves in. Bacardi? Not my usual, but under the circumstances, things could be worse. Just because I didn't bring alcohol didn't mean I didn't bring an abundance of fresh citrus, including the substantial bag of limes from the last convenience store. I fixed myself a cocktail just before the sun went down and my lawn chair sat alone as it set, a plastic witness to a fleeting unnatural majesty, a sentinel before the darkening New England woods stretching far behind. The forest rumbled with thunder from the approaching storm. The technicolor sunset would soon turn a sickly gray, churning and rampaging across the night sky. I had to rescue my beverage as the first drops started to rattle on the overstuffed gutter. Well, that's that then. The drops went from a patter to a tapping to a constant roar punctuated by more sudden natural intimidation displays, thunderclaps, and the uncomfortably close cracks of branches snapping. I watched and listened as the storm gobbled up the hope of a peaceful night and projectile vomited a guarantee that I would need to meet the bottom of my glass to sleep through this racket.
While every living thing in its right mind in the forest that night had taken shelter, 2 eyes intently watched the tiny figure in the window of the cabin from just behind the tree line.
The next morning. The last drops of the coffee pot filled my mug a quarter way, which I slugged down like a complimentary tequila shot. I inhaled deeply and held the breath, filling my lungs with the post-storm smells of mud and foliage. This one had been a doozy. Slowly releasing the soggy air, my eyes drifted from the tree line to the sky. The swirling gray-green clouds rushed by, occasional flickers of sun needling at my vision. I shook my head, taking in another sip of atmosphere while absent-mindedly swirling the empty coffee cup. Some welcome. Realizing my posturing, I looked into the cup. It wasn't empty. A swamp of sooty grounds had collected in the base. The unappealing texture oozed like honey as I rotated the mug in my hand. The sudden snap of a waterlogged branch giving way and crashing to the leafy ground brought me back to reality. I set the mug down, retrieved a coat from my car, and set off into the woods. Why not take a look around? At worst, some mosquito bites and some exercise. Best, maybe an impressive stump or a charismatic toad. The storm had left more of an impression than I assumed from the wreckage in my front yard. Entire trees were downed, torn up from the waterlogged soil with their eldritch roots twisting and reaching unnaturally into the air. If the sky was any indication, last night may have been the preview for tonight's main attraction. Ice-cold water saturated my leg up to the knee as my legs sank into a puddle disguised by a cover of soaked leaves and sticks. I lost my balance and fell backward, cracking that most sinisterly named portion of the human anatomy, the funny bone, against a half-buried rock. The forest rattled and birds took to the air from my string of expletives. Sure, it's nature's fault, not the rum. Nature left this trap here for me to fall into, plotting all along that the result would be embarrassment, discomfort, and a bruised elbow. Taking a less hazardous path along the lake was an easy decision. There was some small distance between the woods and water, which should theoretically be easier to traverse than this brambly hellscape. I plodded along the shoreline, one foot crunching, the other squelching a burbling foot fart with each carefully placed step. I nearly lost my balance on the worn, smooth outcropping of rocks blocking the path. There wasn't time to take in what lay ahead before I stumbled the last few feet to the muddy shore. My eyes first caught the strange stick jutting out from the shallow water, but what lay next to it was the type of bloodshed that no one needed to see at this hour. I stared, mystified by the bloody scene. An adult deer had been decapitated, the corpse on its side, intestines spilling past the water's edge. 4 huge gashes left a trail from its spine to a gaping hole where its stomach used to be. Where the poor creature's head should have been laid a raccoon, splayed on its back. It had been split horizontally down the middle. The raccoon's entrails led to a small pile of dry sticks and foliage gently washing onto the shore. Where's the deer's head? Nothing about the strange massacre made any sense. These animals weren't eaten. They were killed. A curious squirrel inspected the headless deer. We made eye contact for a brief moment, and I imagined the little guy shrugged before scampering off. No conclusion made. That night, I found and finished the second of many bottles of liquor stashed throughout the cabin. Under the circumstances, I felt it was acceptable to use the beverage as a frayed rubber eraser to my memory of the scene. Monday, 2:31 a.m. Clicking and clacking filled the bedroom, followed by crunching and a weak crinkle as the crumpled sheet of paper landed near the pile of its also crumpled predecessors. The pile looked to the newcomer without judgment. They too were deemed unworthy. Up there on the desk next to me and the chattering typewriter, that's where the special pages lived, stacked on top of each other, gorged and overflowing with ideas that passed inspection. I went back to my slow and uneven typing, praying the light rum in my veins would force the creativity out through my fingers. Maybe there was something there, but it wasn't showing its face on the page yet. The protagonist felt disconnected, unrelatable, even pretentious. It suited the story, but I could hear my editor's voice demanding a major rewrite for audience relatability. "How is the reader to connect with someone like this?" he would say, highlighting a particularly sarcastic passage. It didn't matter. That was a champagne problem and a bridge I would cross when I got to it. The rhythm of the keys was soothing. There was a tactile sensation in each key striking. This typewriter came calibrated, balanced, oiled, and inked. A genuine marvel of outdated engineering. Practical? No. Portable? More or less. Personal? Yeah, we were fast friends. The work on the page? Not so much. The words started to drift together. Their letters intertwined and melted away, dripping down the page in black streaks as they returned home to the inkwell below. Down and down it dripped until the page was soaked, darkness filling the innards of the typewriter and pouring out onto my hands, onto the desk, and into my lap. I yanked my hands away and kicked away from the desk, falling backward with the chair. I expected the floor, but was instead greeted with a vat of pure black ink. My ears filled with the stuff, silencing the raging storm outside. I gasped and clawed at my face for air. Tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. The silence was broken while I writhed in the darkness. Tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. Like floodgates opening, the storm came roaring back as I opened my eyes and flung myself backward from the desk in shock. The chair tipped, but I grabbed onto the edge of the desk for support and slowly lowered myself back to safety and reality. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, 2:31 a.m. 2:31 in the a.m., I repeated back to the silent clock with a sigh. A thunderclap jolted me to my senses. Rain streamed down the window as the storm pummeled the tiny cabin. The tree line at the end of the property was a momentary misshapen blur in a flash of lightning. I placed my glasses on the desk and rubbed my bloodshot eyes. Tap. Tap, tap, tap. I lowered my hands from my face and squinted at the blur in the window. Replacing the glasses onto my nose, I leaned forward towards it. Well, there it was. A squirrel tapping at the glass of my second-story log cabin window. In its tiny mouth, the top half of an index finger.
Hey. Yeah, you. You in there. Things are happening out here. Look at this.
I didn't know how I could hear the little guy through the glass. He also had his mouth full. I only knew one thing. It was not an adult's finger the squirrel carried. Whatever bad things were happening out there, they were getting worse.
To be continued. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe at Mutant Ideas, www.mutantideas.com. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, you are not alone with your thoughts. This has been a Mutant Ideas production of The Author versus the Werewolf. Story by Bill Couture and Chris Marti. Narrated by Chris Marti and featuring Lina Dunn as the Squirrel. Original music by Cosmic Monster. The Author versus the Werewolf Illustrated Storybook and Soundtrack Cassette Tape coming soon.